I'm really honored to be back here in Madison, and thank you so much to the Barrymore Theater, WART, WYOU, Alan Ruff, and the folks at the Rainbow Bookstore Collective. Alan really was the guy who spearheaded this, so thank you all for being here and those who worked on this event tonight. You know, when John McCain was speaking the other day, he said, he was talking about his 96-year-old mother. You know, he's talking about the long line of McCains that he comes from. Now, mind you, this is a guy who crashed 5 U.S. planes and I think claims to have shot down 2 enemy planes, so it's sort of 5-2 for McCain, and he's sort of talking about this as a sort of point of bragging, his military career. I actually think his military career is relevant. It should be investigated. What John McCain did to the people of Vietnam needs to be exposed. But McCain is talking about his 96-year-old mother, and I don't quite understand what the point of this story was, but he said that his 96-year-old mother went over to Paris, France, and they told her that she couldn't rent a car because she was too old. So she bought a car and drove around France. And I was sort of saying to like, what the H are you? Is this like Joe the plumber's going to relate to your mom going over, can't rent a car, so she buys one? And I think the point of it was sort of the spirit of the McCain family. But it occurred to me when I was watching that and then coming here to Madison that we have in our midst someone of that generation who went over to Europe in the 1930s, and he didn't go there to buy a car. He went there to fight fascism. And that man is Clarence Scahill, and he's here tonight, a member of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And Clarence, I just want to thank you for the life you've led. There he is right there. The life you've led and the example that you've shown. And Clarence is still a freedom fighter. We love you, Clarence. Thank you so much. I usually go to Clarence to get my recommendation for what book to read next. He said tonight he'd get back to me on the next one. I'm deeply honored to be here with my dear friend Amy Goodman, who is an incredible media hero and a true freedom fighter for democracy in media and democracy in this society. You know, she and I were covering the Republican and Democratic national conventions together, and in fact, we were on the floor of the Republican National Convention interviewing delegates when both of us started to get phone calls saying that one of our colleagues, Nicole Salazar, was being arrested. And I don't know if any of you saw the video of Nicole where she is being beaten to the ground by baton-wielding thugs while she's yelling, "Press, I'm press." And then our friend Sharif Abdel-Qaddous, our colleague at Democracy Now!, went to try to say to the officers, you're arresting a journalist, get your hands off her. And they brutalized Sharif, they cut his arm, they slammed him to the ground, he had a bruise on his chest, and we took photos of him later that night. And Amy went from the floor of the RNC, she sprinted over, ran over with her, you know, anyone who knows Amy knows she's constantly carrying like a huge pile of newspapers in her hands. She's interviewing delegates, there's a microphone buried in like between the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal somewhere in there. So she runs over and she tried to intervene and say, you cannot arrest journalists. And they yanked her across a police line and then arrested her as well. And it was thanks to the efforts of a number of independent journalists, folks like Bob McChesney and Free Press, as well as intervention from Representative Keith Ellison, the first Muslim elected to the Congress, that our colleagues were released swiftly. But it wasn't just journalists who were being targeted. Over 400 people were arrested in St. Paul during the Republican National Convention, and they were arrested by forces that were funded with public money from the federal government. $50 million allocated to the DNC in Denver, $50 million allocated to the RNC in St. Paul to create these stormtrooper operations where these guys are dressed like these Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with their non-lethal weapons, as they're called, to face down against people who had come to demand an end to the war, had come to demand respect for human rights and civil liberties and no more kicking back the rights of people in this country to dissent. And people had a wide range of reasons why they were in the streets of Denver and in St. Paul. And one of the most chilling moments for me actually happened at the Democratic National Convention when the members of Iraq Veterans Against the War, the brave young men and women of that incredible organization, marched on the Pepsi Center where Barack Obama and the Democrats held their party, And they wanted to deliver a list of demands from the IVAW: an immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Iraq of all U.S. forces, including mercenaries and other contractors, adequate health and mental health benefits for veterans returning home, and the payment of reparations to the Iraqi people. Now, the police were in a bit of a situation because they were beating ordinary folks who were dressed the way any of us dress when we go about our lives. But when they were facing down against people dressed in full military uniform, marching on the Pepsi Center, the police, I think, had to make a calculation, and the Democrats had to make a calculation. Are we going to gas these soldiers? Are we going to beat these soldiers? And so they marched up to the gates, and I've never seen anything like this at a demonstration. The police brought out these sort of cherry pickers, the kind of things that they use for fixing the telephone lines, and they lifted up snipers in these little compartments to look down at the crowd with their rifles. And they did this in open view of everyone, and they erected it there almost as an intimidation sign. And people stayed, and to their credit, the IVAW folks stayed there, and they attempted to get their demands heard. Now, of course, the Obama people ran a sort of hoodwink operation and did one of those, well, we'll talk to one person over here, and we'll take your demands, and someone will look at it next year after we win, or whatever their logic was. But the IVAW folks were able to stand down against them and essentially prevented them from beating and gassing the rest of the crowd that day. And we saw many examples throughout the protests in Denver and in St. Paul where veterans groups, Vets for Peace, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, Iraq Veterans Against the War, were among the most vocal people in the streets and on the front lines. And I think those are the veterans that we need to be listening to now. History has been revised. This is the second straight election where the history of the Vietnam War is being revised. John Kerry did it in 2004 when he ran on his record as a, quote, war hero. And now we have John McCain. John McCain, and you can see it on video, admits to knowingly bombing Vietnamese civilians. That's not a war hero. That's a war criminal. And I am so tired of seeing Barack Obama and other Democrats repeat that lie that somehow John McCain is a hero for what he did in Vietnam. This is not a man who belongs on the ballot. This is a man who belongs in prison for what he did. But you can't say that on the campaign trail. No, John McCain is a hero, and the Obama campaign has really pushed this forward. And these things that are masquerading as debates, there hasn't been a single debate yet. If it was a real debate, we would see John McCain, Barack Obama, Ralph Nader, Cynthia McKinney, Bob Barr, and any other candidate with a base of people supporting them. The idea that you can be on the ballot in 45 states in this country and be systematically excluded from the debates is a crime against the democratic process in this country. And I think it's the Democrats who for years have been the force behind excluding third parties from these debates. Barack Obama does not want to debate Ralph Nader because Ralph Nader would expose every aspect of Barack Obama's campaign that is almost identical to John McCain and George Bush's policies. They don't want to talk about those issues. You know, I am not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm a journalist. And I don't have a dog in this fight except that I care about this country and I care about the world. I'm not going to cede my conscience to a politician and act as though voting for that person on Election Day is somehow a revolutionary act or is somehow an act that's going to bring actual change to this country. Now, most of my best friends are in love with Barack Obama to one extent or another, and I'm not trying to break up their engagement to Barack Obama. I want them to cheat on Barack Obama with conscience on the war, on the economy, on policy toward Latin America, on policy toward Africa. But at the same time, I think one of the most destructive aspects of the debate right now is this scurrilous string of attacks on people who believe in building a multi-party system in this country. The idea, they roll out the myth laboratory again, that Ralph Nader lost the 2000 election for the Democrats. No, the Democrats lost the 2000 election because they let the Republicans steal it. And that the moment that Al Gore decided to have his spine extracted from his body was the moment that the Democrats lost the 2000 election. In 2004, it was the Democrats who lost the election because John Kerry ran as a Republican against George Bush. He wanted to be Bush light. And in 2006, the Democrats sweep the elections. They take control of both houses of Congress, and if there ever was a moment in recent history when the Democrats could have shown themselves to be an actual opposition party, it would have been then. And yet, on every major policy, the Democrats have either gone along with the White House or backed down and rolled over. On FISA, on spying. Not only do the Democrats allow, willingly, the immunity to go forward for these telecom companies that spied and facilitated the U.S. government in spying on people in this country and around the world and intercepting their phone calls, but then AT&T was one of the big corporate sponsors of their convention the next week. On the issue of the war, they have continued, vote after vote, to fund it, sometimes offering Bush more money than he actually asked for the war. The Democrats' rhetoric on Afghanistan plays right into the warmonger policies of the current administration, and unfortunately Barack Obama is running around saying George Bush is finally implementing my policy in Afghanistan, which is more troops, more pummeling of the Afghan people. It is so important that we take off partisan caps if we believe in a free society and start looking at what are their policies. Because as much as anyone may believe in an individual or think he's a great speaker, or think that he has the best interests of the nation in his heart, it's not about a man. It's not about one person. It's about who's around them and what are their policies. What Barack Obama has done recently is to take all of the old guard hawks from the Clinton administration and make them the centerpiece of his foreign policy and economic policy teams. The same people that brought you the bombing of Sudan, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, Iraq, are now the people who are with Barack Obama. You have Madeleine Albright, who now is one of the main foreign policy people for Barack Obama. Tony Lake, Lee Hamilton, Susan Rice, people that put forward the myth that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, defended the Bush administration's drive to war against Iraq, mercilessly punished Iraq throughout the entire decade of the 1990s with economic sanctions and no-fly zone bombings. Those are now the people that are helping Barack Obama shape his foreign policy. We need to be critical and not blind at this moment. It's not about who you vote for on election day. It's what you stand for today and what you stand for the day after. That's what matters right now. When you strip Barack Obama down past the rhetoric to the policies and the people, what we'll get from Barack Obama is a continuation of the Clinton doctrine. You listen to Obama talking about reserving the right to use unilateral force, preemptive force, inside of Pakistan. You look at Barack Obama's plan to escalate the war in Afghanistan, his non-withdrawal plan on Iraq, his rhetoric on the so-called war on drugs in Latin America, his almost complete ignoring of Africa in any of his speeches, his complete ignoring of the poor in this country. He talks about the middle class, but none of them ever talk about the poor. They talked about Joe the plumber 23 times the other night at the debate. They mentioned his name, both of them. First of all, he's not even a licensed plumber. Secondly, he owes back taxes. And third, he actually would benefit, according to independent analysis, from Barack Obama's economic plan. But I don't want to hear about Joe the plumber, who's talking about a $280,000 a year business. What does Barack Obama have to say to Jawad the doctor in Iraq, whose wife and son were killed by Blackwater mercenaries on September 16, 2007, and those men walk around as free men, and Barack Obama says, I won't move to ban Blackwater? What is his message to Dr. Jawad? Or what's his message to Kim, the New Orleans resident who was purged from her public housing during the racial cleansing of New Orleans and now can't go back to the city of her birth? What does he have to say to her? Because the Democrats didn't mention New Orleans from the platform during the convention except in Bill Clinton's speech, and it was 2 words. And that's it. That's all they talked about there. What about Abdullah, the Afghan, who now faces the prospect of a renewed pummeling of that country and an escalation of force? They don't talk about poor people. They don't talk about the victims of Bush's foreign policy that was supported by the Democrats. They run both of them to the right. And people say, well, we'll just wait. After Obama wins, then our real work begins to pressure him. You show me in recent history a time when someone ran to the right and governed to the left. Bill Clinton was one of the great Republican presidents of our lifetime in terms of advancing what is traditionally referred to as the Republican agenda. He laid the groundwork for the torture policy. He started the extraordinary rendition program under his administration, the government-sanctioned kidnap and torture program. He laid the groundwork for the Patriot Act. He laid the groundwork for the invasion of Iraq when he signed the Iraq Liberation Act into law in 1998. Bill Clinton bombed Afghanistan before George Bush was ever in power. Bill Clinton attacked Sudan. Bill Clinton escalated the war on drugs in Latin America. You know, my good friend Naomi Klein says that Obama doesn't represent change, he represents the status quo. It's McCain who represents radical change. Another friend of mine, Arun Gupta from The Independent, the newspaper of the Independent Media Center, said the other night at a forum on the economic situation in the country the other night that Obama depresses him and McCain scares him. And it's interesting, you know, Pat Buchanan, the right-wing xenophobic Pat Buchanan, MSNBC commentator, he said that John McCain could make Dick Cheney look like Gandhi. You know, I think anyone in their right mind looks at McCain, who clearly is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and probably needs very serious therapy and help. The idea, and I talked to a lot of Vietnam vets about this, that they see in him what many of them have struggled with, and they say, I wouldn't want my finger being on any kind of a button of that nature, and I certainly don't want John McCain, because when you add what he's going through to the fact that he also seems to be a mentally unstable character, that's a recipe for a very frightening scenario. And hey, the guy's getting on in age, and he's probably not so healthy. To have Sarah Palin step in and be the commander-in-chief, it's like, whoa. We are in trouble if that happens. I mean, serious trouble. On the flip side, you've got Joe Biden. As Colonel Ann Wright said, he's got all sorts of experience. It's just bad experience. You know, we are once again in a position in this country, as much as Obama has ignited this passion, and I think to his credit has gotten a hell of a lot of young people politicized, and he's to be given credit for that, because it's amazing to see how many young people are actually engaged in politics once again. But what road is he going to lead all of these young people down? Because I think that we have to start thinking strategically now about breaking the shackles of this two-party system once and for all. And what we saw in New York when the crash happened and the bailout was being discussed initially was a spontaneous display of democracy in action. People poured into the streets. And I was there on Wall Street. Hundreds and hundreds of people just took to the streets of Wall Street, and they marched through chanting and singing and dancing and yelling, and some of them brought their junk to have bailed out also, and they left it on the steps of some of the major firms and others, and they had great signs. One of them said, you know, no socialism for Wall Street until we get some on Main Street, and another one, I'm sorry, WORT for this one because I'm going to swear, but they also, there was one that a sign, these guys were looking up at a window with these sort of suit and tie guys looking down on them, and the sign just said, "Jump fuckers." And it said, and don't bring your golden parachute. But we saw this spontaneous display, and it was a window into what could happen if people took politics so seriously that they realized that voting is not a revolutionary act, but taking to the streets is, and making your voice heard. That's where change happens. And this economic crisis has been used by those in power as a pacification tool. When people have to fight and struggle to put food on their table, to get their kids off to school, to struggle to find a way to keep that house that they had saved up for their entire lives, and then they were victimized by predatory lenders. When people are engaged in those kinds of struggles, they don't have the energy or the time to be engaged in bigger picture struggles, because the fight is about your family. And they use this economic crisis and the price of gasoline, which of course is artificially inflated. Cars are not fuel efficient because of a conspiracy with the oil companies and the auto industry to help the oil industry. When you have people struggling every day, they don't have the time or the energy to be engaged in these. And I think that those of us who are able to keep our heads above the water and aren't worrying about where our next meal is going to come from, we have an obligation, living in this country in particular, to stand up to those in power and refuse to move out of the way until they are gone. We have an obligation to do that. People say, well, what if there was a coup in this country? Or what if martial law was declared? Now, like many of you, I'm concerned with what has happened over the past 7, 8 years in this country with the Bush administration making it easier for the military to be deployed on U.S. soil in law enforcement type activities. We know that KBR and Halliburton and other companies are being contracted through the Department of Homeland Security to deal with emergency influx of immigrants, as they call it, building these massive detention centers. But the issue here is that I wish that we had a political movement in this country that was so strong that they would think a coup was necessary. I wish Obama was the kind of guy that they would want to overthrow. He's not. He's the kind of guy who's going to keep their interests safe. But we also don't have a strong enough political movement in this country where they would even need to impose martial law, because they have everybody already pacified for the most part. Now, we have to change that dynamic, and that's the conversation that I think we have to start having in this country. How is it that in all the discussions about the economic situation, you almost never hear Obama or Biden linking it to the spending on the Iraq War? We're talking about $2.5 billion spent every week occupying Iraq. Somewhere between 25 cents and 40 cents on every dollar that's spent on the occupation of Iraq goes directly to a for-profit war corporation. Right now in Iraq, there are 145,000 U.S. troops, 196,000 contractors working for 630 corporations with personnel hired from 100 countries around the world. These companies are making a killing off the killing, and they're making 25 to 40 cents on the dollar for every dollar spent on the Iraq war. Afghanistan is a smaller portion of that, but that'll change with the next administration, whether it's McCain or it's Obama. So why don't the Democrats talk about the Iraq war when they talk about the economic situation? It's incredible, because the actual issues that are important to many people go unaddressed at these so-called debates. You know, I think that the town hall forum that they had the other night, as they call the town hall forum, like the people asking the questions had about as much influence over what question they were going to ask as Vanna White has over what letter she's going to turn over on Wheel of Fortune. We don't have a democratic process in this country anymore. The press conferences are almost non-existent with these campaigns, and then we have the exclusion of the third-party candidates. We are moving toward a situation in this country where the coup has already been completed. It's a silent coup. We have now gone from a society where corporations were the dominant influence on those in power to a society that is entirely controlled by the corporations. We are now living in a corporatist society. The movie, I don't know if many of you have seen it, but the Usual Suspects, there's this great line at the end of it where Kevin Spacey's character delivers it and says, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist." The coup already happened. And that's why I think what Naomi Klein is saying is brilliant, that Obama represents a protection of the status quo. So my point here in talking about this tonight is not to tell you who to vote for on Election Day, but to understand that if somebody thinks that the sort of struggle ends when the ballot is cast, you're seriously mistaken about where things are headed in this country. And we need to build a much broader movement that doesn't just target the war, that doesn't just target general issues, but goes after those who are actually in control, the corporations. The Blackwaters, the Halliburtons, the KBRs, the DynCorps, the Fluors, the Bechtels, Triple Canopy, all of these 630 corporations that are making a killing, they're the ones that have a vested interest in keeping these wars going. Because war and corporate profits are now intimately linked in a system that has been devastatingly deadly for so many millions of people around the world just over the past 7 years. And it's our responsibility to up the ante and to actually get away from the blogosphere sometimes. You know, I think that somehow, I think there's great bloggers, and I think that the internet has been used in a way that is fantastic to organize and mobilize. But I also think that it's an excuse for not actually being active. You know, it's sort of like that movie WALL-E, you know, where, I don't know if you saw the movie WALL-E where the people are floating around in those pods. That's kind of how I feel when I go on to Daily Kos or something. It's like, do you people ever leave your computers? Do you ever talk to a person not on IM? Do you ever like go out and actually talk to a living being? You know, if your only connection to the world is your internet connection, something seriously is wrong in your household. So get away from the computers and back in the streets. You know, we had a moment in this country. In 1999, when the US caught up to the social movements across the globe, you know, people say, well, Seattle started it all. No, Seattle was when the US caught up to India and other countries around the world where people actually were taking to the streets, where farmers and working people were actually rising up against corporations. And we had a moment, though, where it seemed like we had momentum, and it was sustained for a while, and it gave birth to the indie media movement in a very real way in this country. And it was an empowering time, and it went all the way through the massive protests on the eve of the Iraq War, when 70 million people across the world simultaneously were engaged in direct actions and demonstrations. We need to wake up again and get back to the business of being in the streets, because that's where the real change lies. We need to become fighters again. One of the things that I think has become clear over the past 8 years in this country is that the Democrats have PhDs in two subjects: losing elections and swallowing social movements. You know, there's a lot of good that can be said about the energy that's been created by the Obama campaign, but it also has decimated the anti-war movement because it's been co-opted. And this man gets up and he says, I was against the Iraq War in 2002, 3, 4, and I'm going to end it in 2009. But he knows he's not going to end it in 2009. He knows that what he's saying to people is not true. And yet people sit there, they're like lemmings, and they just nod their head and they've guzzled the Kool-Aid. And so we have to stop saying, well, we just have to win with Obama and then we can figure it out. No, we need to be consistent in who we are. If we're against the war, then be against the war and be against Obama's platform on the war. If you're against the targeting, of Colombia and Venezuela, then you have to stand up when Obama targets Venezuela in his speeches, as he did the other night when he mentioned Venezuela in the context of we need to siphon ourselves away from foreign oil. He's the one who brought up Venezuela. And I'll say this, at the RNC, Chavez's name was mentioned multiple times from the platform. Chavez is clearly still in their sniper scope. So we have to be consistent. We have to be the same person we are on Election Day as we are every other day of the year. And if we're about ending the war and about standing up for social justice, well, we need to be that same person on Election Day. As my friend Kathy Kelly says, you can't be a vegetarian between meals any more than you could be an anti-war activist between elections. You still need to be an anti-war activist on Election Day. So I throw all of this out not to try to sway you in one way or the other, but to say that the following: stop the attacks on third-party candidates. It's insulting to any democratic spirit in this country to say that anyone doesn't have a right or shouldn't be running. And the myths and the lies that are told about those who believe in third-party politics in this country need to be confronted whenever they rear their head. Number two, anyone who thinks that the voting is an end to itself, I think really needs to have a new way of looking at the situation, because our work begins now. It doesn't begin on Election Day, it begins now. And the final thing that I'll say is that what's so important about the various forces that are brought here tonight, WYOU, Rainbow Books, WORT, Democracy Now!, all of these organizations are some of the most valuable in our society. And as we see a targeting of independent media in the form of arrests, but also in the form of trying to exclude independent entities, organizations, individuals from accessing the public airwaves, that ultimately is a threat to all of us. You know, people make fun of public access. It's the Wayne's World thing. You see some crazy person, you know, playing a harmonica and riding a bike and, you know, giving a high five to a monkey or something on public access. But then you see Democracy Now! On public access, on community television. And the point here is, if we don't defend it, we are going to lose it. And WYOU and WORT desperately need people's support right now, as does Democracy Now!, because these organizations are actually the best financial investment you could make in this political season, because it's the one place you know you're going to go and you're not going to get fed a BS line, and no one's trying to win your vote. They're trying to bring you independent information that will empower you to make your own decisions. And so I'm honored to be here tonight honoring WORT, WYOU, Rainbow Bookstore. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you very much.